I learned the hard way that in my marriage, my silence was treated as proof I was unfit, not proof I was disciplined. My name was Avery Clark, and the day of the custody review was the day I stopped letting that lie stand in public record. The annex sat behind the main courthouse like an afterthought built for controlled fire. All glass walls and brushed steel frames, a room designed to make conflict look transparent while everyone inside performed for rank and paperwork. Fluorescent light flattened faces into official versions of themselves. Polished brass nameplates turned parents into roles. Even the water pitchers looked staged, set at equal intervals as if symmetry could substitute for fairness. Caleb Mercer arrived exactly 9 minutes before call, as he always did when timing could be mistaken for reliability. He came with 3 character witnesses and a smile he had practiced into neutrality, mild enough for judicial trust and warm enough for the observers in the back row who still believed custody hearings were about sincerity. He wore the navy tie his attorney had once called judicial blue and carried a leather folio he never opened because the point was never content. The point was optics. His witnesses clustered behind him in the second row, each with that careful expression of reluctant concern people adopt when they want to appear generous while delivering harm. They were not loud. They did not need to be. I took my seat at counsel table and placed both hands flat on the varnished edge so no one could see the tremor that came with confined rooms. The table smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and old paper. On the wall opposite the judge's bench, a digital clock advanced with clinical indifference, every minute switching on a soft click I could hear between hushed conversations. Caleb did not look at me at first. He greeted the clerk by name, nodded to the bailiff, and clasped shoulders with one witness as if this were a professional reception and not a review of who would shape our child's daily life. I watched him from the edge of my vision the way I had learned to watch unstable code in production. Not emotionally, but for patterns. Before opening statements, he leaned toward me across counsel table, close enough that only 2 rows could hear, and far enough that he could deny intent if questioned. Avery can troubleshoot servers, he said, and his voice carried just enough to land where he wanted it, but she can't raise a stable child. The sentence entered the room like a polished instrument, clean and precise, calibrated for maximum social yield. One of his witnesses lowered her eyes in practiced discomfort. Someone in the back shifted a folder. My attorney turned toward me, waiting for a reaction that could be redirected into objection. I gave none. I did not answer, not because I had no response, but because I had spent 2 years learning that reaction-fed spectacle while documentation survived appeal. Silence was never my nature. It was my strategy under hostile rules. In our first mediation, when I corrected one date in Caleb's chronology, he had raised both palms and called me combative. In the second, when I declined to engage with a personal insult, the facilitator wrote emotionally withdrawn in her summary notes. By the third, I understood the mechanism. Speak, and I was volatile. Refuse, and I was detached. Either way, he kept the narrative center. That was the architecture of it, and architecture does not collapse because you dislike the design. It collapses when you document its load-bearing lies. The bailiff called docket order, and everyone rose. Fabric whispered against wooden benches. The judge entered with the brisk economy of someone carrying 6 files and no illusions, and the room stood still long enough for authority to settle into place. In re-custody review, Clark versus Mercer, the clerk read. My surname came first because of filing sequence, not status, but hearing it said aloud still felt like standing briefly inside my own outline. We sat. Pens clicked. The court reporter adjusted her machine. Caleb's attorney opened with the language I expected. Continuity, stability, child-centered routine, concern regarding maternal availability. Not accusation exactly, something colder, a list engineered to sound responsible while implying abandonment. As counsel spoke, I studied the glass wall to my left where reflections overlaid each other. Judge, parties, observers, fluorescent bars. I could see myself doubled there, one image crisp, one ghosted and delayed by a fraction. That was how the last 7 years had felt, as if I lived in lag while someone else narrated the present tense. Caleb had learned to translate my profession into suspicion. A late instant rotation became nighttime absence. Emergency maintenance became unpredictable presence. My calm became effective flatness. He praised my income in private and cited my workload in public as evidence of maternal deficiency. He repeated those conversions until neutral acquaintances used his vocabulary without recognizing its source. Language, deployed long enough, became infrastructure. The judge asked preliminary clarifying questions, and my attorney answered with measured brevity. I listened to the exchange without interrupting, felt my pulse settle into the pace I used during outage response. Identify variables, ignore provocation, preserve primary objective. Across the room, one witness for Caleb leaned to whisper to another, eyes on me as if evaluating a product under warranty. Their expressions held that small, tightening pity reserved for women judged insufficient in the one domain people still pretend is instinctive. I knew that look. I had worn it from others at school pickups when I arrived in work clothes after a delayed deployment and signed forms with hands still marked by keyboard pressure lines. My child never questioned whether I would come. Adults did. "Ms. Clark," the judge said, "you may confer with counsel now regarding sequence of exhibits." Her voice was neutral, but there was a brief pause before my name, the kind that appears when a courtroom has already absorbed a narrative before evidence begins. I leaned toward my attorney. We spoke quietly about order, authentication standards, and admission protocol. I kept my sentences short. My file tabs aligned in color-coded progression by source and verification path. Each page cross-referenced to chain of custody forms, each form signed and countersigned. Process was the only language that had not betrayed me. While opposing counsel objected to a scheduling detail, I looked down at my wedding band indentation, a pale ring on skin where metal had rested for 8 years and then stopped. I remembered the first month after separation, when Caleb sent a message that read, "We can keep this dignified if you don't make it adversarial." I remembered how quickly dignity in his usage meant silence from me and freedom for him to define the record. I remembered the second year when every cooperative gesture became proof I would yield and every boundary became proof I was difficult. The core wound was not that he left. The core wound was that he translated restraint into deficiency and found an audience eager to believe him. Outside the annex, carts rattled over tile and elevator chimes rose and fell in measured intervals. Inside, the air conditioning vent above counsel table exhaled a cool current that dried my throat and sharpened the smell of toner from stacked exhibits. I took one sip of water and set the cup down exactly where it had been. Caleb's attorney requested that witness statements be heard before technical evidence, emphasizing human context. Human context. The phrase moved through the room with moral confidence, as if facts required personality to become true. The judge granted the sequence with a brief nod. My attorney wrote a note, slid it toward me. "We hold." I wrote back, "Yes." Caleb's first witness took the stand and testified to his consistency. School events, meal routines, predictable bedtime structure. She spoke in smooth paragraphs that sounded rehearsed but not brittle, the cadence of someone coached to appear spontaneous. When asked about me, she paused with deliberate reluctance. "Avery is very competent in her field," she said, "but parenting requires emotional availability." The line mirrored Caleb's sentence so closely it might as well have been copied from his draft. Competent but, present but, caring but. For 7 years, I had lived inside that conjunction, where every strength could be recoded as a flaw with a single turn. The judge watched me as the testimony continued, perhaps waiting for visible fracture, perhaps assessing composure, perhaps simply tracking the room. I gave her stillness. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of containment. I had spent months being instructed to co-parent constructively, as if cooperation were a switch independent of manipulation, as if good faith could survive unilateral edits to shared records and strategic omissions in disclosures. I had done what courts ask women to do when they are disbelieved. I kept logs, preserved originals, documented access paths, retained receipts, created timelines, and answered every request by deadline. I did the unglamorous labour of credibility while being told credibility was a personality trait. By the time the first witness stepped down, the room had settled into the pattern Caleb wanted. He at centre, affirmed by voices, me at margin, defined by restraint. This was familiar terrain. The social choreography had always favoured performance over protocol until protocol became unavoidable. My attorney touched the edge of my exhibit folder and waited for my signal. I nodded once. Across the glass, our reflections overlapped again, but this time I did not see a ghosted version of myself lagging behind. I saw alignment. When the clerk announced a 10-minute procedural recess before evidentiary foundation, chairs scraped and observers exhaled into low conversation. Caleb stood, buttoned his jacket, and accepted a quiet pat on the back from one of his witnesses. He did not look at me. He did not need to. He believed the room already had. I remained seated, hands folded, pulse steady, listening to the fluorescent hum and the soft mechanical reset of the court reporter's machine. Silence had protected him for years because I had mistaken endurance for peace. It had never been peace. It had been the price I paid while building a record strong enough to carry the truth without my voice. When the last line settled inside me, my attorney, Dana Ruiz, leaned close enough that her sleeve brushed mine and said, "They want a technical stipulation conference in Annex B, 10 minutes. Court, IT, opposing consultant, and counsel with party representatives." Her tone carried no surprise, only the practiced fatigue of someone who had seen process used as pressure, often enough to name it without drama. I nodded, gathered my exhibit folder, and stood with the same controlled pace I used when walking into incident review after a production failure. Spine neutral, jaw loose, no visible urgency. The hallway outside the hearing room smelled of floor polish and burnt coffee. A deputy guided us past a row of glass offices to a smaller conference room with a wall monitor, 3 charging carts, and a long grey table scarred by years of binder rings. Caleb was already there, not seated, but angled against the far wall with his counsel and the expression of a man attending his own favourable audit. 2 contractors from the court's technology vendor occupied the head end of the table. One wore a county badge and the clipped confidence of someone who believed infrastructure was authority. The other had a tablet open to a chain of custody template and kept tapping the same field as if repetition could fix uncertainty. Opposing counsel's consultant, Martin Keane, stood by the monitor with a laser pointer and the patient smile of an expert witness paid to translate complexity into dismissal. Dana and I took the side seats nearest the power ports. No one offered introductions. They all knew who I was. They simply preferred the version of me they had already heard. Keane began with procedural language that sounded neutral until it narrowed. Given time constraints, we propose limiting digital exhibits to user-facing exports and communication summaries already exchanged in Discovery. Ms. Clark has submitted a preservation memo with extensive technical scaffolding. In this venue, that level of architecture is over-engineered. He glanced at the contractors, who gave small confirming nods. To be direct, it risks confusing the tribunal and obscuring practical parenting facts. Over-engineered. The words sat in the room with the same function as unstable, emotional, difficult. I could feel Dana turning toward me, prepared to object on foundation and prejudice, but I raised 2 fingers under the table, and she held. The first contractor, Alvarez, rotated the monitor so we could see a spreadsheet of exported messages with bright conditional formatting and clean date columns. "This is the standard display," he said. "Readable, courtroom efficient, consistent with prior cases. We don't need deep auth logs or retention mirrors unless there's a breach allegation. There is no confirmed breach in this docket." "There is a manipulation allegation," I said, keeping my voice even, "and your chain of custody form omits the secondary retention mirror from the co-parenting platform. Without that mirror, selective deletion activity is invisible in the user-facing export." The second contractor, Feld, gave a short exhale through his nose and didn't look up from his tablet. "With respect, that is not how these platforms typically function in domestic review. You're applying enterprise incident methodology to a family matter." Caleb spoke then, from the wall, not to me but into the group. "That is her pattern. She takes ordinary conflict and makes it technical so nobody can tell what actually happened at home." The line was precise, pitched for shared recognition, and it worked. Keane lowered his eyes in polite discomfort. Alvarez shifted his weight and crossed his arms, and Feld finally looked at me as if confirming a private diagnosis. Caleb continued, "She can document anything except consistency." The humiliation was not volume, it was consensus posture. Men with badges, titles, and invoices turning my method into temperament in real time inside a courthouse that treated data admissibility as a scheduling nuisance until it threatened someone's story. I felt heat rise behind my ears and the old reflex gather in my chest, the one that wanted to list every corrupted timestamp, every edited thread, every night I answered from a server room floor while being told I was unreachable. Instead, I opened my folder, slid out the court-approved handling protocol, and placed it at the center line of the table. Section 4, subsection C, I said. When authenticity is contested, native logs and retention mirrors are mandatory for comparative review. This token image was generated by court order under that subsection. Hash values are attached. If you limit display to curated exports, you create evidentiary asymmetry. Keen's smile thinned. Ms. Clark, no one is accusing you of bad faith. We are trying to keep this comprehensible for the bench. That standard should apply to all parties, I said. Comprehensible is not the same as incomplete. For 3 seconds, no one spoke. The fluorescent ballast above us buzzed with a faint, irregular tremor. Down the hall, a copier door slammed and someone laughed too loudly at a private joke. Caleb pushed off the wall and stepped to the back of my chair, close enough that I could smell his cologne, cedar over alcohol. Avery, he said quietly, still for the room. If you cared this much about bedtime routines, we wouldn't be here. Dana's pen stopped moving. Alvarez looked away toward the glass, suddenly interested in passing traffic. The old social equation presented itself with brutal clarity. If I turned and answered with full force, I would confirm volatility. If I absorbed it, I would confirm weakness. For years, that binary had been his most reliable asset. I kept my eyes on the protocol sheet and spoke to the contractors, not him. Please state on record whether you collected from both the primary event stream and mirrored retention store. Feld tapped the template, hesitated, and said, Primary stream only. Thank you. Then the form is incomplete for a contested authenticity review. Keen tried to reclaim pace. This is exactly the overcomplication concern. We can stipulate to best effort extraction and move to testimony. Dana finally entered, voice calm and edged. No stipulation. We proceed under the order as written. My client's token is available for independent examiner review, and we request the omission be noted now. Caleb made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. Of course she wants more delay. I turned to him then, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet his eyes and remove the comfort of speaking around me. I want a complete record. That was all. No accusation, no history, no heat. No. His expression flickered, not guilt exactly, more irritation at a script disrupted by brevity. 3 days earlier, I had still been checking every transmission receipt before midnight, cross-verifying custody handoff messages against gateway authentication logs because one undetected gap could be turned into a character argument by morning. The labor had become muscle memory. Export, verify, hash, seal, document chain, repeat. Not because I believed the system naturally favored truth, but because truth without structure dissolved on contact with performance. Alvarez cleared his throat and gathered papers into a neat stack. Fine. We'll annotate the mirror omission and defer to the independent examiner. But for display in court, we should keep visuals minimal. Minimal is acceptable, Dana said. Selective is not. The deputy at the door announced 2 minutes to reconvene. Chairs shifted, cables were unplugged and recoiled with brisk, irritated motions. Caleb straightened his tie in the wall reflection and returned to his counsel without another word to me. As we filed into the corridor, Feld stopped beside Dana and said in a low voice, intended for discretion but audible to me, If this spirals, the judge may view it as adversarial theatre from both sides. Dana answered before I could. Then the side with raw logs and validated hashes should do just fine. Back in the annex, the observers had multiplied. 2 law students occupied the rear bench with legal pads open, and a clerk from another department stood near the door pretending not to listen. The court reporter reset her machine, and the bailiff called us to order. Seating changed for evidentiary sequence exactly as Caleb's counsel requested. He remained centered beside his attorney while I was moved 1 chair outward to make room for the evidence monitor technician. It was a small displacement, physically minor, socially loud. Center signaled authority, edge signaled accessory. I took the outer chair, aligned my papers, and refused the urge to pull my seat inward by even an inch. Caleb's second witness testified about continuity. She described him as stable, available, predictable. When asked about me, she used careful concern like a credential. Ms. Clark is very accomplished, but children need softness, not systems. A few heads in the back row dipped in sympathetic agreement. The judge wrote without expression. My pulse remained steady, though I could feel each phrase land against old bruises I had stopped naming out loud. Accomplished, but reliable, but devoted, but. The conjunction did most of the damage and left no fingerprints. During cross, Dana asked 3 short questions and exposed that the witness had observed our child at home exactly twice in 2 years. The answer did not collapse the testimony, but it changed its weight. I watched the judge's pen pause, then resume with a different pressure. Caleb noticed it too. His jaw tightened for half a second before he smoothed it away. When the witness stepped down, Caleb requested permission to briefly clarify context. The judge allowed 1 minute. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed the bench with rehearsed humility. Your Honor, I am not questioning Ms. Clark's intelligence. I am questioning whether a household can feel safe when every interaction is treated like an audit trail. My concern is emotional presence. Then, turning just enough for the room to hear, he added, Our child does not need a systems administrator. She needs a mother. The sentence drew a visible reaction this time. One observer inhaled sharply, another lowered her gaze to her notebook. Dinah half rose to object, then sat when the judge lifted a hand. The old reflex surged again in me, bright and immediate, a full-body demand to answer with everything I had kept indexed and contained. I could have recited dates, screenshots, provider receipts, school attendance confirmations, bedtime call logs authenticated by server signature. I could have described the nights he locked me out of the app, then filed declarations about my failure to engage. I could have given the room the unedited version of every polite lie. I did none of it. I uncapped my pen, wrote 1 line on a yellow legal pad, and slid it to Dana. Let the examiner speak first. She read it, nodded once, and folded the note into her folder without comment. My restraint was not passivity, it was sequencing. Caleb still believed narrative came before proof. He still believed if he occupied enough social air, the record would bend around him. The judge looked from him to me, then to the exhibit list. We will move to Digital Evidence Foundation, she said. Counsel, call your examiner. Dana rose. Respondent calls Commander Elias Trent, retired independent digital forensics examiner, appointed under court order. A murmur passed through the back row at the name, small but unmistakable. Even Alvarez at the tech station straightened in his chair. As the side door opened and Trent entered with a plain black case and a stack of sealed reports, I rested both hands on the table and felt, for the first time that morning, not calmer, but exact. Silence had never been peace. It had been discipline under hostile interpretation, a holding pattern until the record could carry more weight than performance. When the clerk reached for the oath card, I placed the matte black hardware token beside Dana's folder, case seal facing up, and kept my face still while the room recalibrated around evidence. The clerk swore Commander Trent in, and he answered with a voice that had been trained to cut through radio static and bureaucracy in equal measure. He took the witness chair without looking toward Caleb, placed his plain black case on the narrow ledge, and waited for Dana to finish foundation questions. Even at rest, he had the contained posture of someone accustomed to audit rooms where one inaccurate verb could cost months. His grey suit was unremarkable, but his report binder was not. Sealed tabs, indexed annexes, and a chain of custody cover sheet clipped with the court's blue evidence ribbon. I recognized the format before he opened it. It was built for challenge. Commander Trent, Dana said, did you receive materials from both parties under the court's appointment order? I did. Did those materials include the encrypted tokens submitted by Ms. Clark? They did. Did you independently verify integrity values before review? I did. He said each line without ornament, not trying to persuade anyone, only narrowing the room to procedure. Caleb's attorney objected twice on pacing, once on scope, and the judge overruled each with the same brief sentence, "Foundation is proper." While Dana and Trent established credentials, I watched Caleb in profile. He kept his hands folded over his folio, chin elevated at a practiced angle of patient tolerance, as if this were a temporary detour before the court returned to what he considered real evidence. Personality, impressions, audience memory. He had lived on that terrain for years. He had taught people to evaluate me there. The first time he did it, we were still married and attending a parent orientation at our daughter's kindergarten. I had left an on-call rotation early, arrived in office shoes and a sweater that still smelled faintly of server room coolant, and sat beside him while the teacher reviewed dismissal procedures. When she asked which parent usually handled pickups, Caleb smiled and said, "Avery handles critical outages for hospitals, so we never know if she can make it." He said it lightly, as if praising me. The teacher wrote something next to my name and shifted eye contact back to him for every follow-up. Later in the parking lot, I told him the comment had been unnecessary. He kissed my forehead, called me sensitive, and reminded me he had only told the truth. By the second week of September that year, the school volunteer coordinator had started emailing him first for classroom logistics, even on days I was listed as primary contact. "Ms. Clark," Dana murmured without turning, "I need your copy of Exhibit 14. I slid it to her, and she handed it to the clerk for marking. My fingertips were cold despite the over-conditioned room. Trent reviewed the exhibit map and confirmed the sequence. User-facing exports, provider receipts, gateway records, mirrored retention logs, hash reports. Caleb's counsel stood for cross-foundation and asked whether family court data could be interpreted multiple ways. Trent answered, "Any data can be misread if context is omitted. That is why acquisition scope matters." Omitted context had been Caleb's most reliable instrument. 3 years into our marriage, when my mother was hospitalized after a stroke, I drove between the rehab unit and our apartment for 6 weeks while still covering maintenance windows at night. I cried exactly once in front of him, in the laundry room with the door half closed. The next month, during a disagreement about preschool tuition, he told me I was emotionally unpredictable under pressure. He repeated the phrase in counselling, and by the third session the therapist asked whether I had considered a stress management group. I remember the lamps in that office, brushed nickel and warm bulbs, trying to soften the fact that my private grief had been converted into evidence against my stability. I remember agreeing to breathing exercises because arguing about context had started to sound, even to me, like defensiveness. Dana moved to admit Trent's preliminary integrity findings. Opposing counsel requested voir dire on methodology. The judge allowed it. Caleb's consultant, Keane, stood from the second table and asked Trent whether his extraction workflow was enterprise-heavy for domestic litigation. Trent looked at him once, then at the judge. "Counsel asked me to evaluate authenticity disputes," he said. "Authenticity is not a mood. It is a chain." No one spoke for a beat. The court reporter's keys ticked steadily. Behind me, one of the law students stopped writing and looked up. When we separated, invalidation became procedural. Caleb filed declarations that praised my technical brilliance while questioning my maternal attunement, and mediators copied the wording because it sounded balanced. During one session, he brought printed screenshots of our co-parenting app showing 3 unanswered messages. He did not include the 5 messages directly before them, where he had changed exchange locations twice in one afternoon and locked editing permissions for 15 minutes at the exact handoff window. When I tried to explain sequence, the mediator interrupted, "Let's avoid getting lost in digital minutiae." Caleb sighed, apologized for my intensity, and offered to simplify communication for the child's sake. I left that office with a recommendation in the summary notes that I reduce adversarial technical framing. The phrase followed me into subsequent evaluations like a stain I could not point to directly. Dana asked for permission to approach the witness with the physical token. The judge nodded. I watched the clerk receive the matte black drive from counsel table with both hands, log its transfer, and carry it to Trent. Small object, dense consequence. The case seal caught the fluorescent light in a thin silver line. For months it had lived in a locked evidence pouch in my home office, nested between custody calendars and provider invoices, less than 3 inches long and heavier in meaning than any affidavit I had signed. It contained what people said they wanted from me for years, proof, yet every step toward preserving that proof had been characterized as aggression until the court ordered it. "Please identify this item for the record," Diana said. Trent adjusted his glasses and read from the tag. Court Exhibit 22A. Encrypted hardware token, tamper evidence seal intact. Acquisition reference number matching my appointment packet. Did you access its contents? Yes, under supervised extraction protocol. Did you find evidence of alteration within the token image? No. Hash continuity is consistent from acquisition to analysis. He placed the token on the witness ledge exactly parallel to the binder edge, and the gesture was so deliberate it felt ceremonial. Not dramatic, not sentimental, just precise. In that room, precision was a form of respect I had not received in years. Caleb's counsel rose for cross and attempted to reframe the object as excess. Commander, is it fair to say this level of preservation is uncommon for ordinary parents? It is uncommon, Trent said. Counsel paused, then smiled slightly. Then would you agree it suggests a litigation mindset rather than a co-parenting mindset? No, he said. It suggests foresight where records were at risk. The judge looked down at her notes, then back up at him. At risk from what? Selective deletion, schedule edits, and geotag manipulation in a contested communication platform, he said. All documented in my report. The room changed temperature without any vent noise. Caleb shifted in his chair for the first time that morning and reached for his water glass, though he did not drink. I did not look at him directly. I focused on the token, on the matte surface that showed one faint scuff near the corner where I had dropped the evidence pouch on my kitchen tile 2 nights before filing, and stood there, shaking, until I confirmed the seal was still intact. That night had followed one of Caleb's cleanest distortions. He had sent a message at 6:03 p.m. confirming he would return our daughter by 8 o'clock. At 7:41, the app showed my location pinging 30 miles away near an industrial park, followed by a missed check-in alert generated in my name. By 8:09, he filed an emergency addendum alleging I had failed to appear at exchange and refused contact. I was at home at 7:41 on video with our daughter helping with spelling words while dinner cooled on the stove. I had provider logs, home gateway authentication, and the call recording, but by the time I submitted them, the accusation had already travelled through 2 legal inboxes and one evaluator's preliminary note. I remember standing over the sink after she fell asleep, hands submerged in cold water because my palms were burning, and realising the burden had shifted permanently. I was no longer responding to misunderstandings. I was documenting sabotage. 3 days after that incident, I requested raw event logs from the co-parenting platform through counsel. Opposing counsel resisted, then delayed, then produced partial exports with missing fields. Dana drafted a motion to compel mirrored retention data and asked if I wanted to push, warning me it would be painted as escalation. I said yes. Not because I trusted the court to reward rigor, but because I knew what would happen if I stopped. Caleb's story would settle into official language, then into memory, then into fact by repetition. During those weeks, he kept texting in the gentlest register. We should de-escalate. This is harming everyone. If you cooperate, I won't have to keep documenting concerns. Every message carried the same structure, threat framed as care, coercion framed as reasonableness. On redirect, Dana asked Trent to explain in plain terms why the token mattered. He turned slightly toward the bench, hands resting flat on the report. User-facing exports show what an interface chooses to display, he said. Mirrored retention logs preserve underlying event history, including edits and deletions. The token contains both with verification values. Without both, the court sees a narrative. With both, the court sees sequence. Sequence. That was the word I had been trying to defend in every room where my credibility was treated as temperament. Not whether I could sound composed, not whether I looked maternal enough under fluorescent light, but what happened first, what happened next, and who touched the record in between. Caleb's counsel objected to argumentative characterization. The judge overruled and told Trent to continue. He opened his binder to a tab marked Comparative Event Matrix and asked permission to publish a single demonstrative. The screen lit with 2 columns, left side user export thread, right side mirrored event stream, timestamps stacked in military format, alteration flags in amber. Even from my outer chair, I could see the missing lines on the left where entire exchanges had been removed, and the right column entries showing credentialed actions tied to account keys assigned to Caleb's profile. No raised voices followed. No one needed them. I felt the old pressure in my chest loosen by a measurable degree, not relief yet, more like structural load redistributed from bone to beam. For 7 years, I had been asked to perform credibility through tone, while the record beneath that tone was being edited. Now the record was visible in paired columns, large enough for the back row to read. Diana asked one final question for this segment. Commander, did Ms. Clark's preservation method assist or obstruct your ability to determine authenticity? It enabled it, he said. Without her protocol, this review would rely on incomplete exports and conflicting recollections. He closed the binder. The token remained on the ledge, inert and undeniable, the smallest object in the room and the first one that had not asked me to translate my own reality into someone else's comfort. The judge instructed counsel to prepare for substantive findings after a brief recess, and the bailiff called a 10-minute break. Chairs moved, whispers rose, files shifted. I stayed seated, eyes on the matte black drive, while people around me recalculated what kind of mother they had thought they were looking at, and what kind of record now stood between that assumption and the truth. I stayed where I was while the room emptied into islands of whispered strategy, my chair still angled outward from counsel table as if I had been temporarily attached to my own case. Caleb did not approach me. He did something more efficient. He stood beside the evidence monitor with his attorney and one of his witnesses, speaking in a measured tone that carried just enough for the back benches and not enough for formal objection. "This is exactly what I was describing," he said, eyes on the dark screen, not on me. "A normal parenting disagreement converted into a technical spectacle." He let the last word rest there, then added, "My daughter needs steadiness, not forensic theatre." The witness gave a sympathetic nod, the kind that looked civic from a distance. I watched their reflections in the glass wall rather than their faces. 3 figures aligned at centre while I remained at the margin, and I felt the old pressure return, familiar as the hum of a server rack at 2 a.m. Dana stepped out with the clerk to resolve an exhibit sequencing issue, leaving me for 2 minutes at the table with my legal pad, my water cup, and a room full of people trying not to stare. 2 observers in the second row began discussing school calendars in undertones and then went quiet when they noticed I could hear them. Caleb's third witness, a man from his community board, passed behind me and said to no one in particular, "Courts can get lost in data and miss the human pattern." He kept walking. It was mild enough to pass as principle, targeted enough to land as message. I did not turn around. At the side station, Alvarez and Feld reviewed cable connections for the next display set. Field glanced in my direction and said, low but audible, "If this keeps expanding, the judge may split the difference just to close the docket." Alvarez answered, "That would be typical." Neither sentence named me, yet both positioned me as cause of expansion, architect of inconvenience, woman who had failed to understand that efficiency outranked completeness when a courtroom calendar was full. I wrote one line on my pad, "Process pressure is still narrative pressure," and underlined it twice. That sentence was not for argument. It was for orientation. When Dana returned, she set her folder down and said, "They requested to confine rebuttal to demeanour evidence after lunch. Denied. We proceed on digital sequence." Her voice was steady, but there was a flush at her neck that told me how hard opposing counsel had pushed at sidebar. They also asked to keep Trent to summary conclusions. No step-through matrix. I looked at her. Ruling? Judge will allow step-through if she controls pace. Dana sat, leaned in a fraction, and gave me the only reassurance she ever offered in hearings. "Stay with the record. Don't answer commentary." 9 minutes into recess, the bailiff called us back to order. The choreography resumed with almost mathematical precision. Caleb and counsel centred, monitor technician to their right, Dana to my left, and me returned to the outer chair where sightlines required a slight lean to see the full screen. The physical arrangement was presented as logistics. Its social meaning was older than logistics. At centre sat the person presumed to define events. At the edge sat the person expected to respond to them. Caleb placed both palms on the table before the judge entered, occupying space with deliberate calm. He didn't look at me when he spoke, but he made sure I heard him. "You can still simplify this," he said quietly, mouth barely moving. "Stop trying to win a systems argument and start acting like a parent." I kept my hands flat on my folder and answered without shifting posture. I am acting like a parent. He gave a soft, incredulous breath, then looked up as the judge took the bench, expression reset to respectful concern. The switch was clean enough to feel rehearsed down to muscle memory. Proceedings resumed with Caleb's counsel requesting permission to call one additional character witness for context regarding emotional continuity. Dana objected on cumulativeness. The judge allowed 5 minutes, no more. The witness took the stand and testified in careful managerial sentences about Caleb's reliability, always present at weekend activities, always responsive to schedule changes, always emotionally available. Then came the turn everyone in the room expected, and no one named directly. Ms. Clark, he said, appears organised, but children need warmth they can read in real time. Organised, but it arrived again, identical mechanism, different mouth. Dana's cross was short and exact. How many overnight care transitions have you personally observed between these parties in the last year? The witness hesitated. None directly. How many co-parenting app threads have you reviewed in full native format? None. So your conclusions are based on conversations with Mr. Mercer and social observations? Yes. Dana thanked him and sat. The testimony did not collapse. It thinned. Still, the social effect lingered. Even weak testimony, repeated with confidence, could stain a room. Caleb requested 1 minute for personal clarification, and the judge granted 30 seconds. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed the bench with practiced restraint. Your Honour, my concern remains simple. I am not disputing Ms. Clark's intelligence. I am asking whether this level of procedural escalation reflects the emotional climate our daughter needs. He paused, then delivered the line to the room without turning his head. Children do not grow secure inside audit trails. The observers behind him absorbed it in silence. A clerk near the door lowered her eyes to her tablet, typing quickly. I could feel the sentence moving outward already, detachable and quotable, ready for hallway retelling. My pulse rose once, then steadied. Then, the urge to answer came sharp and immediate, accompanied by vivid memory. My daughter at the kitchen table sounding out spelling words while my account showed a false geotag 30 miles away. Me on hold with a provider escalation line at 10:17 p.m. Caleb filing a declaration at 10:24 alleging non-response. I could have spoken that sequence into the air and been accurate. Accuracy was not the same as admissibility. I uncapped my pen, wrote, "Wait for authentication statement," and slid the note toward Dana. She read it, folded it into her file, and nodded once. The judge looked down at her docket, then to the witness stand. Commander Trent, please return for clarifying testimony, she said. He rose from the second row seat where he had been reviewing exhibits and took the stand again with the same contained posture, as if this were not a contested custody hearing but a formal audit board where sequence determined consequence. The bailiff reminded him he remained under oath. Trent acknowledged with a single nod. Opposing counsel stood first. Commander, for the court's practical management, can you confirm whether your conclusions depend on technical assumptions beyond ordinary judicial understanding? Trent folded his hands on the ledge. No. Can these records be interpreted in multiple ways? User-facing exports can. Native event streams with validated hashes constrain interpretation. Counsel tried a different lane. Is it fair to say Ms. Clark's data collection approach was unusually extensive? Yes. Could that extensiveness itself indicate adversarial intent? Trent looked at counsel, then at the judge. Intent is a legal conclusion. My scope is integrity, the judge interjected. Then address integrity directly, in plain language. Trent opened the comparative event matrix and asked permission to publish page 3 only. Granted. The monitor lit with paired columns again. Left side curated thread, right side mirrored event history with credential tags and deletion markers. He used no laser pointer, only his index finger on the printed copy. At 1941-08, a geotag event appears in the user export tied to Miss Clark's account. In mirrored retention, the event source is not her device token. It is an injected location update generated by credentials assigned to Mr. Mercer's administrator, Access. He shifted one line down. At 19:43:12, 3 prior messages are deleted from user visible thread. Deletion action key matches same credential family. At 20:09:04, filing draft timestamp references non-appearance claim. Those events occur in sequence. No one moved. Even the air system seemed quieter, though I knew it was not. Counsel objected to characterization. Overruled. Counsel objected to attribution certainty. Overruled pending foundation already admitted. Trent continued with the same pace. Ms. Clark's token preserved both interface export and mirrored retention, with continuous hash verification from acquisition to examination. The contractors collected primary stream only. That stream cannot reveal these edit and injection actions independently. He turned one page. Provider receipts and home gateway authentication corroborate Ms. Clark's active connection at the residence during the disputed interval. The judge leaned forward. Commander, answer this precisely. If the court had only the standard exports produced by the petitioner's side, what would be the risk? Trent's response changed the room. For the record, he said, voice level and unadorned, Ms. Clark's preservation protocol is the only reason this tribunal can distinguish native records from manipulated exports. The sentence landed with procedural force, not drama, and that made it heavier. A pen dropped in the back row. Alvarez at the side station lowered his eyes to the table and adjusted a cable that did not need adjusting. Feld stopped typing. Dana did not look at me. She simply placed her hand flat over my folded note, as if securing it in place. Caleb sat very still, then reached for his water glass and found his grip half an inch off center before correcting it. His face had not changed color yet, but his jaw worked once then again, as though language had become a mechanical task. The judge asked one final clarifier. Commander, do you have any indication Ms. Clark altered the submitted records? None, he said. Her preservation choices increased transparency. Any indication Mr. Mercer's credentials were used in actions inconsistent with ordinary messaging behavior? Yes. Documented? Yes, in Exhibits 22A through 22F and corresponding report annexes. Opposing counsel requested a brief opportunity to confer with consultant. Granted, 3 minutes. Caleb leaned toward his attorney, speaking quickly now, one hand flat on the table as if bracing against motion. Keene joined them, brows drawn tight, flipping through his notes with abrupt, clipped movements that contrasted with his earlier polished ease. No one in their cluster looked toward me. They no longer needed my reaction to animate their strategy. They needed a way to survive their own record. By the time the 3-minute conference ended, the hierarchy in the annex had reassembled around evidence rather than demeanor. It was subtle, but complete. Observers who had been watching faces were now watching timestamps. The contractors who had treated my memo as excess were speaking in technical shorthand with lowered voices. The clerk near the door requested duplicate copies of the matrix pages for the bench packet, without being prompted by either side. Caleb's earlier line about audit trails still existed, but it had lost gravitational pull. It was now commentary attached to contradicted sequence. The judge directed both counsel to prepare for findings argument in evidentiary order and instructed the clerk to mark Trent's clarifying statement for emphasis in the transcript index. Then she looked at me for the first time that afternoon with no pause before my name. Ms. Clark. Remain available for limited factual confirmation if required, she said. The court has what it needs on integrity, I answered. Yes, Your Honor. I did not smile. I didn't look toward the back benches to measure anyone's revised opinion. I kept my hands steady on the folder and watched the matte black token resting in its evidence tray under fluorescent light, small and sealed, and finally understood for what it was. Not escalation, not theatre, not temperament, but the hinge between allegation and record. The judge called counsel to argument without raising her voice, and the room obeyed, with the reflex of people who understood that volume had stopped mattering. We will proceed in evidentiary order, she said. Petitioner first, limited to the digital integrity findings and their relevance to custody factors. Caleb's attorney stood, buttoned his jacket, and moved to the lectern with a stack of annotated tabs that suddenly looked heavier than paper should. Your Honor, he began, even accepting the examiner's technical concerns, the court still has a broader duty to assess emotional continuity and day-to-day stability. He kept his tone respectful, almost pastoral. We submit that data irregularities in an application environment should not eclipse testimonial evidence regarding caregiving presence. He turned one page. At most, this is a communication platform conflict, magnified by mutual distrust, not proof of parental unfitness. Mutual. The word was selected for ballast, a way to redistribute weight across two people when one set of credentials had already been named in open court. Dana did not move while he spoke. She drew one line under a heading in her notes and waited. Caleb sat beside her line of sight, still centered at counsel table, one hand on his folio and the other resting flat near his water glass, as if posture could still hold the room together. Opposing counsel tried a final narrowing maneuver. The petitioner acknowledges no system is perfect. Timestamp anomalies occur. Export discrepancies occur. The issue before this tribunal remains the child's lived experience, not whether one parent documented digital interactions with unusual sophistication. He paused, then delivered the sentence he wanted indexed. Technical fluency should not be mistaken for parental fitness. The judge looked at him for a long second, then at the monitor where the matrix page remained frozen, amber flags aligned beside deletion actions and credential keys. "Counsel," she said, "the court is not conflating fluency with fitness. The court is determining whether evidence submitted to challenge maternal reliability was manipulated. Continue if you have authority that this distinction is immaterial." He did not have that authority. He offered one case citation on generalized best interest standards and returned to character framing. By the time he finished, his cadence had lost its earlier confidence and settled into the narrow rhythm of someone arguing for damage control while pretending it had been his strategy all along. Dana rose without theatrics. She did not carry a stack of binders, only the marked exhibit list and 2 pages of handwritten notes. "Your Honor, this is not a close credibility call," she said. The petitioner asked the court to reassign primary custody based on alleged maternal non-response, instability, and absence. Those claims were built on curated exports now shown to be altered through credentials tied to the petitioner's account. The independent examiner confirmed sequence, attribution markers, and verification continuity. "We request 3 things. Strike credibility assertions dependent on manipulated records, deny the petition for primary custody, and enter a structured order that protects communication integrity going forward." She stepped 1 pace closer to the lectern, then stopped. "My client's method was described repeatedly as adversarial excess. It was, in fact, preservation under contested authenticity. Without it, this court would have been forced to choose between demeanor narratives. With it, the court can choose evidence." No flourish followed. She returned to her seat. The fluorescent light caught the edge of her legal pad, and for a moment the room held that exact stillness that comes after a precise instrument has done its work and before anyone admits what it cut. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Clark, stand for limited factual confirmation." I rose. The chair legs gave a brief scrape against tile that sounded louder than it was. "Did you, at any point, alter the native records submitted under Exhibit 22 series?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you preserve those records under court order and counsel supervision?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you provide access credentials requested by the independent examiner within ordered timeframes?" "Yes." She studied my face as if checking for rehearsal. "Were there periods when you were unable to access the co-parenting application?" "Yes, repeatedly." "Did you document those lockouts contemporaneously?" "Yes." "Anything further you need to add for accuracy, not argument?" I could feel Caleb looking at me now, waiting for expansion, waiting for one sentence he could recast as hostility. I gave the court what it asked and nothing else. "Only that the records reflect sequence more clearly than memory does." The judge nodded. "You may sit." By 3:17 p.m., the shadows from the annex window frames had shifted 1 pane lower across the floor, and the observers in the back row were no longer watching expressions. They were watching the bench for language that would outlive the hour. The judge removed her glasses, set them on the file, and began oral findings in the measured register of someone building a record for review rather than applause. "The court has considered testimony, exhibits, and the independent examiner's analysis. On this record, the tribunal finds that multiple user-facing communication exports presented by the petitioner are incomplete in ways that favour the petitioner's asserted narrative. The court further finds credible forensic evidence of selective deletion, schedule edit interference, and geotag event manipulation tied to credentials associated with the petitioner account. The court does not find evidence that Ms. Clark altered native records. She turned one page. No one moved. Accordingly, the petitioner's credibility claims regarding respondent non-response and instability, to the extent dependent on those manipulated exports, are given no weight. Character testimony premised on those claims is correspondingly diminished. A brief pause. The petition for primary custody transfer is denied. Caleb inhaled once, sharply, as if he had forgotten there was air in the room until that line required it. The judge continued. Given demonstrated interference with communication records, the court enters the following interim structure, pending compliance review. Respondent Avery Clark is granted primary legal custody. Petitioner Caleb Mercer is granted supervised visitation under county-approved protocols, with progression contingent on documented compliance, including verified communication conduct and no further credential misuse. A neutral monitoring channel will be implemented for co-parenting exchanges. Any future submission of curated exports without native corroboration will be treated with heightened scrutiny. The words were procedural. Their impact was public and absolute. The hierarchy Caleb had curated through witness order, seating centre and polished concern broke in one continuous line of findings, not because anyone raised a voice, but because the bench replaced impression with sequence and put that replacement on record. Opposing counsel stood halfway, sat, then stood again. Your Honour, for clarification on supervision parameters, you may file a written request for modification after 30 days of compliant conduct. The judge said. Not today. He tried once more. And on the issue of intent we preserve, preservation is noted. Findings stand. The court reporter's machine clicked without pause, sealing each sentence into transcript. Dinah exhaled through her nose, almost soundless, and closed her folder. She did not reach for my arm or turn with victory in her face. She simply handed me a copy of the minute order request sheet and pointed to the signature line I would need before we left. Professional? Contained, exact. It was the only kind of solidarity the room could not misread. Then came the second movement, quieter and more revealing. Destabilization in plain sight. Caleb's face lost colour in increments, as if someone had lowered saturation one layer at a time. The flush that had carried him through witness testimony drained from his cheeks and settled into a flat grey tension around his mouth. His throat worked once, then again, with no words emerging. He placed both hands on the table, fingers spread, pressing hard enough that the tendons stood out at his wrist. For years he had depended on speech as leverage, timing as leverage, audience as leverage. Now the audience had shifted to the exhibits, and his hands looked like the only stable surface he could find. One of his witnesses leaned toward him, whispering what might have been reassurance or strategy. He did not respond. Another reached for her bag, fumbled the zipper, and stopped trying. Eyes fixed on the bench as though still waiting for a correction that did not come. The community board witness who had spoken about human patterns stared at the matrix page on the monitor with a baffled expression, then looked down at his shoes and remained there, suddenly unwilling to be seen endorsing anything. At the side station, Feld removed his glasses and cleaned them, though they were already clean. Alvarez requested, in a low, formal tone, permission to append a technical correction to his earlier extraction note. The judge granted it without comment. It was a small administrative gesture, but I felt it like a structural beam settling into place. The contractors who had dismissed mirrored retention as overreach were now entering omissions into official record under oath-bound proceedings. Keane, the consultant who had called my protocol over-engineered, shuffled his pages into a new order and stopped every few seconds to check the same line in Trent's annex, as if repetition might produce an escape hatch. None appeared. He spoke to opposing counsel in a clipped whisper, and I caught only fragments. Credential family, no clean rebuttal, a mitigation posture. Caleb heard enough. His jaw tightened, then released into a blankness that looked less like composure than shock. The judge asked the clerk to read back the custody disposition for clarity. As the clerk spoke, Caleb finally lifted his head and looked directly at me. Not with anger at first, with disbelief, Stripped of performance, the look said what his voice no longer could. This was not the script he had prepared the room to follow. He opened his mouth once, closed it, and swallowed hard. When he tried to speak to his attorney, no sound came on the first attempt. On the second, he managed, "We appeal," but the words were thin, detached from the authority he used to wear so easily. His attorney answered in the careful tone reserved for clients hearing limits for the first time. "We can evaluate options. Right now we comply." Comply. The words seemed to strike him physically. He leaned back, then forward again, eyes unfocused for a second before locking on the table grain in front of him. His right hand drifted toward the water glass and stopped short, hovering, then flattened back to the wood. The movement was small, involuntary, and more revealing than any outburst would have been. He was bracing not against accusation, but against the loss of narrative control. The judge finalized scheduling. Compliance review date, supervised exchange logistics, digital channel directives, transcript priority. Each item landed with administrative calm. Each item narrowed his room to maneuver. When she asked whether either side required immediate clarification, Dana said, "No, Your Honor." Opposing counsel requested one minor timing adjustment for intake processing. Granted. Caleb did not speak again. The bailiff announced adjournment. Chairs slid back. Papers lifted. People stood in clusters, then separated according to new gravity. No one approached Caleb for the supportive shoulder clasp he had collected before the break. His witnesses gathered their belongings in silence and exited one by one, avoiding eye contact with both tables. The law students in the back row compared notes in hushed, urgent tones, already translating the hearing into doctrine for someone else's classroom. Trent secured the token transfer log, signed the final chain line, and handed the sealed evidence tray to the clerk with the same care he had shown at every step. I signed where Dana indicated, initialed the margin correction, and watched the clerk stamp the minute order. The sound was crisp, final, almost metallic. Caleb remained seated while the room thinned around him, shoulders rigid, face ashen, hands still spread against the table like a man steadying himself on a deck he had assumed was fixed. No speech could have undone that image. No argument could have restored what the record had just removed. I stood, gathered my folder, and turned toward the aisle without looking back for permission from anyone who had mistaken discipline for deficiency. The reversal had already happened in the only place that mattered. On the record, in open court, where his version could no longer stand unsupported, and my child's life no longer depended on who performed concern more convincingly under fluorescent light. I stepped into the aisle with my folder against my ribs and the minute order carbon copy still damp from the clerk's stamp. And the first thing I noticed was the clock on the far wall clicking over to 3:26, with the same soft mechanical sound it had made all morning, indifferent before testimony, indifferent after ruling, as if time itself refused to take sides. Behind me, chairs continued to scrape in short, restrained bursts. Ahead of me, the glass door held my reflection in two layers, one clear and one faintly delayed, and for the first time all day the lag was gone when I moved. "Avery." Dana's voice was low, work-focused. "Don't leave yet. We need evidence disposition and service confirmation." I turned back to counsel table. Caleb was still seated, his attorney bent toward him, speaking in a tone too quiet to carry. His witnesses were gone. The woman who had lowered her eyes at his opening line passed behind him without stopping, coat folded over one arm, mouth set in a straight line that could have been embarrassment or retreat. She never looked toward me. The community board witness kept his gaze on the floor until he reached the door, and then he was gone too, never offering the clarification his expression had promised when the matrix went on screen. Some looks were admissions. Some remained unfinished forever. Dana guided me to the clerk's station near the bench. Fluorescent light hit the polished brass nameplate hard enough to turn the engraved letters white at the edges. The clerk, Miss Harlan, adjusted her glasses and reviewed the transfer sheet with procedural calm. Exhibit 22A through 22F remain under court seal pending transcript certification, she said. Primary token is logged to Evidence Locker B17, duplicate forensic image to Docket Archive 4C, accessed by written order only. I nodded. And the chain correction? She slid a second form across the counter. Filed. Mr. Alvarez submitted a technical correction acknowledging omission of mirrored retention acquisition in the initial contractor worksheet. It's appended as Court Note 12. Her pen tapped one line. You initial here to confirm you received notice. I initialed. Paper against paper made a dry whisper. A thread I had carried for months, whether that omission would vanish into hallway memory, was now pinned to docket text where memory could not edit it. Commander Trent approached with his binder closed and his expression unchanged, formal, but not distant. "Ms. Clark," he said, "for completeness, the provider receipts you preserved were cross-verified this afternoon against carrier return headers. Clark has those confirmations. No further action required from you unless there is appellate remand." "Thank you," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "For saying exactly what mattered." He gave one brief nod. "You built the record. I read it." Then he signed the final examiner line, capped his pen, and left through the side door without waiting for gratitude to become conversation. By the time we reached the hallway, the annex had shifted from hearing theatre to administrative corridor. A janitorial cart rattled over tile. Someone in another room laughed once and stopped, as if reminded where they were. The smell of burnt coffee returned, overlaid with citrus cleaner. Dinah stopped near a glass office and opened her phone. "One more operational step," she said. "We serve certified copies now, so there's no timing game on supervision intake. I'm emailing opposing counsel and County Family Services with the signed minute order while we stand here." She turned the screen toward me. I watched her attach the stamped PDF, the transcript priority request, and the supervision protocol page. She hit send, then forwarded me the sent copies and read receipt request. 2 minutes later, the first confirmation appeared from County Intake. Received. Processing immediate scheduling under court directive. 3 minutes after that, opposing counsel replied, "Acknowledged. We will comply and await intake assignment." No argument, no flourish. Just language, stripped to obligation. "External contacts resolved," Dana said, half to herself, half to me. "If they file anything, we answer on paper." I exhaled for what felt like the first full breath since morning. "What about the platform vendor disclosure we requested last week?" "Callback came while you were on the stand." She scrolled and handed me the screen. "They released full audit API documentation under the compel order. It matches Trent's findings and is now moot for trial posture, but preserved for enforcement. I'll lodge it as supplemental notice so it doesn't disappear." Moot for trial posture. Preserved for enforcement. The language was dry, exact, and profoundly merciful. At the elevator bank, we waited under hammered steel grey light reflected off the brushed doors. Caleb and his attorney approached from the far corridor and stopped at the opposite call button, 10 feet away, a distance that felt both narrow and final. He had recovered enough colour to pass a hallway glance, but his mouth remained tight and he held his folio like a brace. He spoke without looking at me. "I'll follow the order." Dinah answered before I could. "You'll follow all of it." He swallowed, eyes fixed on the elevator numbers. I said I would. The doors opened. We entered first. He did not join us. 3 days passed before County Family Services called with the supervised visitation intake time, and I was in my kitchen when the phone rang, my laptop open to a maintenance dashboard out of habit I had not yet unlearned. The intake officer introduced herself, confirmed case number, and read terms in measured sequence. Neutral facility, monitored exchange logs, no unilateral app permission changes, no direct message deletions, weekly compliance review for 30 days. Her diction was clinical, almost kind. "We also received the corrected contractor note and examiner annex," she added. "Those are attached to your supervision packet. You don't need to resend." "I won't," I said. At intake the next morning, the waiting room had waxed floors, pale walls, and chairs bolted in rows that made every parent sit facing a laminated poster about cooperative communication. Caleb arrived on time, alone. No witnesses, no audience. A case monitor named Priya led us into a conference room with a square table and 2 identical pens placed at opposite sides like neutral territory. "We are not here to relitigate," Priya said. "We are here to implement court order safely and predictably. Mr. Mercer, you will use Channel C for all scheduling. Ms. Clark, you will acknowledge receipt within the defined window. Neither party edits prior messages. Any technical disruption is reported through this hotline, not handled privately. Understood?" "Understood," I said. Caleb nodded. Understood. Priya handed him a compliance acknowledgement form. His hand hovered for a second before he signed. The same man who had once treated every process step as optional narrative now signed each line with careful pressure because there was no social space left to improvise. Process had replaced performance. When the meeting ended, Priya walked us to separate exits. At the door, she paused beside me. "For what it's worth," she said, keeping her voice professional, "the documentation quality in this file makes implementation cleaner for everyone, especially the child." "Thank you," I answered, and meant it without needing more. That evening, I sat at my dining table with the final certified packet spread in a strict row. Minute order, supervision schedule, Trent's annex, contractor correction note, service confirmations, and the vendor documentation Dana had lodged as supplemental notice. I scanned each page into my home archive, generated checksums, and printed the hash report. Old muscle memory, now in service of closure instead of survival. Then I placed the originals in a fireproof box, labelled the tab Custody Review Final Order, and locked it. One physical item remained unresolved, the matte black token itself. At 8:14 p.m, Ms. Harlan called from the clerk's office with the short efficiency of someone closing a file correctly. "Ms. Clark notifying you that Exhibit 22A remains sealed in B17 pending expiration of appeal notice window. If no stay motion is granted, it transfers to long-term evidence archive. You will receive written notice either way." "Thank you for calling," I said. "It's in the record now," she replied, and hung up. No stay motion came. No witness who had watched me from the second row contacted me to revise their concern. No contractor tried to reclaim his first dismissal after filing correction. The loaded glances stayed what they had been, social weather at the edge of a formal storm, memorable but non-binding. The next Friday, after homework and dishes and the ordinary negotiations of bedtime, my daughter asked if court was finished. I tucked the blanket under her shoulder and chose the only accurate answer. "It is finished in the way that counts," I said. "The rules are clear now." She considered this, then nodded as if clarity were as concrete as a locked door. "Okay." Within minutes, her breathing settled into sleep. I stood in the hallway outside her room while the house moved through its small night sounds. The refrigerator cycling on, a pipe ticking once, wind pressing lightly against the kitchen window. The silence was no longer a courtroom tactic or a marital tax. It did not ask me to disappear so someone else could sound reasonable. It did not carry the weight of unsent rebuttals or missing lines in exported threads. It held because the record held. My name is Avery Clark. I did not win by speaking louder, and I did not heal by being believed in private. I built proof where I had been erased, carried it into the room that measured my fitness, and left with an order that matched the facts. Silence wasn't peace. It was the price I paid while I was constructing the bridge. Sovereignty was crossing it and never walking back.